ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः. We are continuing our discussion on the interesting story of Girish and Ghosh. Because this is a continuation of the previous lecture, so I shall try to recapture in a few words some of the points that I made in the last session. He was born in the year 1844 and passed away in the year 1912. And his story would have been totally different if he had not come in contact with Sri Ramakrishna. It would have ended in a tragedy. So the one important point that I made in my previous session was, whatever may be a man's accomplishments, his intellectual powers, literary achievements, his creativity, whatever may be his other intellectual and scholarly achievements, whether in art, literature, philosophy, or music, painting, whatever may be, if he doesn't have some anchor, something to hold on to in his life, some kind of an ideal, higher ideal, his life will be a failure. It will end in tears and agony and tragedy. So, now, how he came to know Sri Ramakrishna. So, it's a very interesting story. There was a well-known newspaper in India at that time. It was known Indian Mirror. It was established in the year 1861. That was the time when Girish Chandra Ghosh was making his name as a great dramatist and playwright. Of course, it was much earlier, but anyway, he was still growing up. And he happened to read something about Sri Ramakrishna in this newspaper. This newspaper was founded by some intellectuals who claimed themselves to be radical reformers of Hinduism, who were actually trying to westernize and Christianize Hinduism in their efforts to reform it. As we know, this Keshav Chandra Sen, who was Sri Ramakrishna's well-known disciple, was the celebrity of the city. He was himself an important leader of this movement. It's called Brahma Samaj, which was actually founded by Raja Ram Mohan Roy in the year 1828. And this Raja Ram Mohan Roy himself presents a very conspicuous figure in Indian history. He was a great idealist, well-educated, a self-made intellectual, and he was a scholar in Persian, Arabic, not so much in English, which he picked up only much later, and maybe he was not a great scholar in Sanskrit or traditional authentic Vedanta scriptures. Though he knew Sanskrit, but he interpreted the scriptures in his own style. But he was, some kind of a intellectual freelance, but he was driven by a strong zeal to put an end to all social injustices that he found in the conservative Hindu society of the place where he was living. And he was actually instrumental in getting this terrible social institution called sati, we call widow burning. That's how it is known in English language. In the early days, it was a symbol of pure life and chastity and the devotion of a wife to husband. But later on, it became a monstrous social injustice in India. Not all over India, but in some distant corners of Indian subcontinent. mostly in some extreme western corner like Rajasthan, and also in the extreme eastern corner of India. So, and this man who got this band with the help of the officials of East India Company, and he later his ideas endorsed by the Anglican Bishop of Calcutta. So he was a radical reformer, was intellectual freelance. He was the founder of this Brahma Samaj. Now, something interesting to complete a picture of this man, I can quote one interesting statement from Annie Besant. And who was Annie Besant? Annie Besant was one of the leaders of Indian National Congress, which was later led by Mahatma Gandhi, one of the earlier leaders of Indian National Congress. And she was also a prominent figure in Theosophical movement, along with Colonel Orcott, Blavatsky, and others. And this Annie Besant, she was born in Ireland, very similar to Sister Nivedita, Miss Margaret Noble, a radical, firebrand Irish woman who was driven by the zeal, the Vedantic zeal, who became maybe the most prominent Western disciple. The most important Western disciple was an Irish woman who was a freelance intellectual, almost some kind of a revolutionary. Now, her predecessor was Annie Besant, and she was a fanatical Hindu nationalist. That's the only way to understand, because she was so much dedicated to Hinduism and so much devoted to Indian culture, Indian soil. It is said that when she first landed in Bombay, she fell on the ground, and now I have come back to my karma bhumi. Karma bhumi is a Sanskrit word she used. It means she had already become familiar with such expressions. I have now come back to the place of my own destiny. That's what could be a proper English translation, not literally translations. And she said about Keshav Chandra Sen, who was a prominent Brahma Samaj leader at the time of Girish Chandra Ghosh, a contemporary of Girish Chandra Ghosh. He said Keshav was trying to Christianize Hinduism from within. So that was what Keshav Chandra Sen was doing actually. An attempt to Christianize Hinduism from within. He was trying to reform Hinduism in the light of his own Unitarian teachings, which he perhaps imbibed from his own English friends and intellectuals of Calcutta. So Annie Besant was a staunch Hindu who was not willing to endorse the views of Keshav Chandra Sen. And Girish Chandra Ghosh used to attend this man's lectures. Of course, Keshav Chandra Sen later became a great devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. He became a saintly figure later. At the masterly touch of Sri Ramakrishna, he became a very great devotee. From an iconoclast to an agnostic to a pure, pious Hindu spiritual aspirant. That is his evolution, Keshav Chandra Sen. So this newspaper was founded by people who belong to this radical reform movement, which is known as the Brahma Samaj. And it was established in the year 1861 by Debendranath Tagore, who was a member of the Tagore family, and also one Manomohan Ghosh, two intellectuals of the city. In that newspaper, he came to know of a saint living in Dakshineshwar, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, who taught that God can be reached through many paths and all can reach God. And there is truth in all religions. Any person who is sincere, honest, and pure at heart can reach God, no matter what religion or what religious faith system he belongs to. He may be, or he may not have any formal spiritual affiliation. Still, if he is sincere, a pure aspirant, he can reach God. Now, this was something unique to Girish Chandra Ghosh. Remember, Girish Chandra Ghosh was not so well versed in Vedic literature, because Vedas proclaimed this again and again. Ekam Sat Vipra Bahudha. There are hundreds of verses in Vedic or Vedantic literature which proclaim this idea that God can be reached by any person who is sincere and honest and pure-hearted. And Sri Ramakrishna is sometimes described as Veda Murti, means Vedic teachings which take a human form. That is what Sri Ramakrishna. But so Girish Chandra Ghosh, as I mentioned, he was a non-conformist. He was not willing to accept anything or anyone blindly. He was ready to question everything, and was a very proud man. Lot of intellectual arrogance and lot of creativity, which he displayed in some of the greatest dramatic creations of Bengali theatre during the early days. He is considered to be one of the founding fathers of Bengali theatre. Now, he considered himself to be a sinner, a lost man, haughty, proud, and at the same time a drunkard who led a very indisciplined life. And he came in contact with Sri Ramakrishna, and in the last session we discussed how he started on a new spiritual journey after coming in contact with Sri Ramakrishna. Now there is an interesting dialogue in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna with something very unique. I don't know if anything like that exists in any other religious scriptures. A dialogue between a teacher and his disciple. The disciple is not a pious, humble, soft-spoken, a man of humility. No. The disciple who later became a disciple, he is a haughty, proud, indisciplined person who was proud of being a drunkard, who was a genius, but without any self-restraint, unhinged. That's the only word we can use it. He used to play dramas in the streets, and he was looked down upon not only by the elite intellectual sections of society, but by the majority of people. And this man came to Sri Ramakrishna. Now, last time we discussed this power of attorney, how Girish Chandra Ghosh gave his complete spiritual responsibility to Sri Ramakrishna, and that helped him to start on a new spiritual journey, and how he eventually became a great saint, a great spiritual aspirant, and how he ended his life with a sense of bliss, inexpressible spiritual joy within. How his life ended in a state of absolute bliss. So this is how he became a saint, by coming in contact with Sri Ramakrishna. So the dialogue goes like this. One day, Girish Chandra Ghosh decided to surrender himself completely to Sri Ramakrishna. Now there is a dialogue. This dialogue, rather, it actually, in a way, is a graphic picture of the evolution of a spiritual seeker from a state of chaotic, indisciplined, wayward life to a spiritual path, which eventually took him to the highest spiritual realization. The first sentence, Sri Ramakrishna's first instruction: hold on to God with one hand. No, before that there is something. Do just what you are doing now. This is the first stage. Sri Ramakrishna doesn't ask Girish Chandra Ghosh to stop drinking or to put himself under some discipline. What he says is, just continue doing what you are doing now. And what is he doing now? Drinking, living a very indisciplined, wayward life, writing plays and dramas, and being ridiculed by the so-called elites of the society, at the same time not caring a damn for anyone or anything, and ready to speak out his mind to everyone. That was it. So the first instruction is, do just what you are doing now. And Girish Chandra Ghosh was not unhappy about it. He did not know what he was actually in for. Now, if a drunkard or a drug addict who can't live without drugs and drinks, if he is told by his teacher, well, you continue doing what you are doing, the drunkard will not be unhappy. He is perfectly okay. But Girish didn't know what he was being led into. Now, but then Sri Ramakrishna continued. Hold on to God with one hand and to the world with the other. Think of God at least in the morning and evening. Think of God at least in the morning and evening. That's what really created problems of Girish Chandra Ghosh. So he did not perhaps clearly understand what was meant by Sri Rama's instruction. You hold on to God with one hand and hold on to the world with the other. He didn't perhaps get the full implication of this statement. But when Sri Ramakrishna asked him to think of God in the morning and evening, there was something which he suddenly felt, well, he can't do that. Because as a normal person who was always in a state of influence of alcohol, how can, as a sincere person, give a promise, I will think of God in the morning and evening? Two categories of people won't be aware of the sunset and sunrise. The highest spiritually enlightened persons. For them, God is an ever-present fact in their everyday life, in their everyday existence. So they don't have to think of when it's morning or the evening to think of God, because they are always immersed in the thought of God, a mystic or maybe a realized person. So they don't care for morning because they are beyond rituals, beyond conventions. They don't wait for the sunset or sunrise to think of God, always thinking of God. Another person also has the same experience. He is always in a state of, drunkenness. He is not aware of the sunrise or sunset. When the sun rises in the east, he is not aware of it. So also at the time of sunset. So Girish Chandra Ghosh belonged to the latter category. And now the greatness of Girish Chandra Ghosh was, he was ready to admit this problem. Many people won't do that. That's why they don't make a progress, So the point is, when a person is aware of his own limitations and problems, and when he is taught to how to remedy those problems, he has a lot of hope in front of him. A person who is illiterate or uneducated, if he admits, I'm not educated enough, so I have to go to college or school, there is a lot of hope for him because he can seek admission into a school or a college. He can get education. But suppose an ignoramus claims to be omniscient, all-knowing, then there is no way for you, there is no way to educate him. So Girish Chandra Ghosh's advantage was, he was so sincere, so earnest, and so truthful. In fact, he was one of those persons, not too many of them, rare persons who could unite thought, word, and mind. Thought, word, and deed, so to speak. So he was a sincere person. So he told Sri Ramakrishna, I can't do that because he said that he's a drunkard. He may sleep in the theater where he's playing the drama, maybe in the streets. Maybe he doesn't know when he gets up in the morning and when he goes to sleep. As Sri Ramakrishna told him, the morning and evening is impossible. Then Sri Ramakrishna modified his instruction. Third stage. Well, if you cannot do that, then remember God before you eat and before you sleep. Now, every person eats food, just like breathing air, and every person needs sleep, whether he likes or not. No, that also Girish Ghosh found very problematic. He can't remember. His mind is so absolutely chaotic, indisciplined, unhinged. He can never be sure when he's going to eat, and even if he remembers, he can't be, he thought he can't be sure to remember God before eating food or before going to sleep. Nothing is within his control. He is a creature of his impulses, very impulsive person. So you find in his life, suddenly he was visiting a place of bad reputation, and suddenly he felt an impulse. No, I must go to Dakshineswar and meet Sri Ramakrishna. Just think of that. And Sri Ramakrishna didn't mind that, because Sri Ramakrishna knew this person has got one great supreme virtue. He was sincere. He was drunkard, he was ready to admit he's a drunkard. There are many, in fact, if you read some of his dramas, in dramas deal with not only spiritual teachers and mystics like Chaitanya, Buddha, and also his dramas deal with Mir Qasim, Siraj Dawla. These are all autocratic Muslim dictators of Bengal who practically, the whole history is not so very pleasant, so I don't want to go into those details, historically speaking. So he wrote dramas not only depicting the stories of great spiritual teachers, but also of people who were not so very spiritual. So he was a very, very indisciplined person. Now Girish Ghosh thought that also he cannot promise. He can't promise to think of God and to remember God, to the name of God before eating and before sleeping. And the fourth stage, Sri Ramakrishna told him, well, so you are unwilling to agree even to this. All right, give me your power of attorney. Henceforth, I will take full responsibility for you. You won't have to do anything at all. So he gave his power of attorney at the fourth stage of his spiritual evolution. So to begin with, he said he can't think of taking the name of God or think of God in the morning and evening, and he cannot do that before eating and before sleeping. Then finally Sri Ramakrishna gave the last option: you should give your full responsibility to me. Now, apparently, this idea is found in many mystical traditions. This idea of self-surrender you find in all great religious traditions with some mystical aspect in it. But the word power of attorney is used here, as I mentioned last time. It is totally different from the power of attorney as we understand in law. Because in law, in modern constitution, power of attorney can be reverted, it can be cancelled, it can be suspended. It is not such an inflexible commitment. But in spiritual life, power of attorney cannot be revoked. It cannot be revoked. It cannot be suspended. Because once you surrender yourself, then in a way you become a spiritual slave. But that spiritual slavery is actually only another name for spiritual freedom. The spiritual slavery indicated the power of attorney or self-surrender. Actually, it opens the doors to spiritual freedom. That's the beginning of one's spiritual freedom, really speaking. Till then, we are slaves of our own senses, our own impulses, our own lower drives. When a person, when he directs his ideas, thoughts, impulses and feelings in a spiritual direction, then actually that self-surrender is actually the road leading to spiritual declaration of independence, so to speak, using in modern language. change. So that's what we consciously. Actually, the divine will begins to operate through such a person. Just like you are trying to cross the river, and there is a boat in front of you. You are sitting on the bank of the river, but the first thing you have to do, you should get up, and it involves some human effort, and you have to untie the boat. You have to break the chains that binds the boat to the anchor, and then you should start rowing. Then you can reach a millstream, you can go across the river. But suppose we go on rowing, working hard, whole night, without breaking the chains that bind the boat to the anchor, then you won't be moving 1 inch forward. So without this spiritual surrender, we won't be entering the bus leading to freedom. We won't be boarding the bus. We won't be entering the road to spiritual freedom. In fact, there is this kind of, there are people who tell you, well, I won't care for anything. I don't believe in God, but I believe in some kind of a spirit. Or I want to go about doing good for others. It only ends up haughtiness, our misconceived or mistaken notion of freedom, and our mistaken notion of spiritual independence may prevent us from resorting to this spiritual mechanism, which is this power of attorney in the language of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. We may not feel like doing that because we feel we are surrendering ourselves to somebody. But remember, if we don't surrender ourselves to a higher ideal, we'll be surrendering ourselves to every petty, dangerous impulses that comes to our mind. In fact, this problem is illustrated in an interesting verse that you find in Shankaracharya's famous work, Vivekachudamani. But before that, something else I want to mention. Once Sri Ramakrishna told, and Girish Chandra told a devotee, and Girish he happened to overhear this. The statement was, all smell, he said, Girish Chandra Ghosh heard this statement, you may wash 1,000 times a cup that has held a solution of garlic, but is it ever possible to get rid of the smell of garlic altogether? Sri Ramakrishna was making this statement to some devotees, and Girish happened to overhear this. There was a vessel, a cup or something, filled with some foodstuff made with garlic. It contains the smell of garlic. Not easy to remove that. Maybe in modern, of course, remember this was long before the modern chemical solutions were discovered for dishwashing things. So you have to think of those times. So Sri Ramakrishna said it's very difficult, almost impossible, to remove the smell of garlic from a vessel. Then Girish asked Sri Ramakrishna, will this smell of garlic ever go? Sri Ramakrishna replied, yes, it will. Then Sri Ramakrishna continued, all smell disappears when a blazing fire is lighted. If you heat a cup smelling garlic, you get rid of the smell completely. It becomes a new cup. So what it means is, you can, of course, get rid of the smell of garlic from a cup. But for that, you have to reheat it. So you have to think of the context and the times when these statements were made. So that means this complete responsibility that you give to another higher spiritual ideal, it helps us to start on a new spiritual journey. It actually breaks all the entanglements of samskaras and vasanas and vrittis that we have already accumulated in our mental system. Through innumerable life cycles, in actions and thoughts and words, we have already accumulated a big storehouse of samskaras, impressions and tendencies. Some of them very bad, some of them very negative, some of them very good also. So, and they come into conflict. And that's how we normally feel a great joy, a sense of inner bliss when we read a spiritual book, or when we attend a prayer session, or when we go to a temple or a church or any place of worship. When we associate with spiritual persons, we feel a kind of inner bliss. That's because there's a lot of positive spiritual samskaras already in our mental system. But we suddenly lose that when we go out of that place of worship, or when you are in another situation. So that's because there are these two opposing forces of negative and positive samskaras. But what happens when you surrender yourself completely to a great spiritual ideal? What happens, the whole thing gets neutralized. It's just like heating a cup. When you heat a cup completely, all the samskaras, good and bad, all disappear, and at the end, only good samskaras remain. So now the question arises. There is a interesting verse in one of Shankaracharya's well-known shorter works. It's called Prakarana Granthas, Vivekachudamani. How we normally lose control over ourselves. Oh, what must have happened to Girish Ghosh? The verse is very interesting. Lakshichudam ched yedi chittameshat behirmukham sannibadet tatastataka pramadada pratyuda keligantukaha sopana panktu padido yatha tatha. So the idea is, sopana pankti means just ladder, or maybe a staircase, the better translation. A staircase. A staircase is a lot of steps, a flight of steps. Suppose you take a rubber ball and you drop that rubber ball from the top of the staircase. Or accidentally, it's a more literal translation, accidentally, suppose a rubber ball that you're holding in your hand, it happens to fall on the top of the staircase. What happens, it bounces and leaps and it comes down step by step. It won't stop till its velocity is extinguished. It won't stop its falling down till it hits the ground. So this is what really happens. So in spiritual life, if a person doesn't apply the spiritual mechanism of surrender, which Girish Ghosh did, what happens, you have to watch every step. You should be very alert all the time. Because this mind, like a rubber ball, it may fall. And once it falls, it won't stop there. It will stop falling step by step till it reaches the ground. It's not possible for us to watch the thoughts and actions and words and impulses, feelings and emotions that are going on in our life. It's impossible. One may go crazy. But one can do something which is relatively easy. One can have strong faith in some higher ideal. And this strong faith gives you the courage and the sincerity to surrender yourself, or to link your life to a higher ideal. This surrender is not a very pleasant word in modern times. I understand it very well. So I would perhaps use this term, let's say, dedicate. Surrender has got a very, very negative connotation because of its association with many unpleasant ideas that come in a train. I would say dedication. Sri Ramakrishna asked Girish and Ghosh to dedicate himself to him or to give full responsibility to him. In normal life, what we can do, we can integrate our actions, our feelings, our thoughts, everything to some higher ideal. And if we don't have the courage and the humility to do that, thinking that no, I won't dedicate myself, I am my own, I am an independent person. If you are trying to get independence from a higher spiritual ideal, you will be the slave of 1,000 unpleasant impulses. That's an important thing. If we can dedicate ourselves to a higher ideal, that will open the door, the road and the door leading to freedom. And if we don't have the humility, if we want to assert our own freedom by giving full freedom to our senses and impulses, then we will be the slave of our own impulses. So, spiritual freedom begins when we get freedom from the senses. Giving freedom to senses is not spiritual freedom. It is the road leading to spiritual slavery. But on the other hand, if we can restrain our senses by dedicating ourselves to a higher ideal, that's a road leading to real spiritual freedom. In fact, there are many, many verses here. Of course, the Vivek contains many, many verses which I am perhaps not going to details right now. Now, we can easily find out that Girish Chandra Ghosh's life, his story would have been totally different if he had not dedicated himself to this higher spiritual ideal. He could rewrite his life, he could rewrite his story, and he could lead himself to a higher level of spiritual freedom and higher creativity by dedicating himself to a higher spiritual ideal. Sri Ramakrishna happened to be the right ideal in front of him. Now, there are many interesting stories from the lives of great monks and great spiritual teachers, and also from ancient Hindu mythological works, which tells you of the need to be alert all the time. If you have to watch your own steps all the time. See, we cannot, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot watch our mind and thoughts and impulses all the moment. But we can dedicate our whole life to a higher ideal, then that higher ideal will slowly start influencing and controlling and restraining and regulating and organizing and giving a new creative direction to all our thoughts without our being aware of it. There's an interesting story. It comes in the Bhagavad-Purana. It is one of the most celebrated stories. It is often depicted as explained to illustrate the same point that we discussed in Girish Chandra Ghosh's life. There was a great emperor in India. His name was Bharata. So, in ancient times, it was a common practice for great kings to relinquish this kingdom and go to a forest to devote the rest of their lifetime to spiritual practices. It's a common practice. When a king gets old, he will leave his kingdom. We go to maybe a hermitage in the forest, maybe to an ashrama or any lonely place, solitary place in the banks of a river in a forest, and will spend his lifetime in meditation and contemplation. In fact, many of the great hymns of Vedas and many of the great teachings of Upanishads came from those retired spiritual seekers. There's something very interesting in fact, the Upanishad literature. You find King Panchala, Ashupati. There were some of them were great kings who have retired to forest hermitages and spent the rest of their lifetime in meditation and contemplation. So this King Bharata also decided to do this. He left his kingdom, went to a forest. He built a small hut, a hermitage on the banks of a river, and started his life as a mendicant, as a hermit, devoting his whole lifetime to meditation and contemplation. Now, once it so happened that one day he was sitting on the bank of a river, and he found a female deer who was being chased by a lion, and as it crossed the stream to escape from the lion, it gave birth to a baby deer, and it passed away. It died in that effort. So this little tiny baby deer was floating in the waters. So the king, very compassionate man, he plunged in the river and saved the baby deer. And that animal began to grow up in the hermitage. So he was a very compassionate person. So what happened, he slowly forgot his meditation, his spiritual disciplines, and began to spend all his lifetime in taking care of the little animal, giving food to it, to save it, always remaining on guard, to save it from wild animals. So he was a very old man by the time, and he had left his kingdom. He has left his own children and grandchildren in his palace, and had come to this forest to spend the rest of his lifetime in meditation, contemplation. But now what happened, he slowly lost his alertness, and he slowly began to be somewhat less punctual in his spiritual disciplines and practices. He forgot to meditate. Instead, he'll be sitting there watching the tiny animal running about and all that. What happened, It was time for him to die now after several years. And this man who had left his kingdom to meditate on God was being concerned about the fate of the little animal at the time of death. And what happened, when the animal died, when the king died, he was reborn as a deer. So the great king who had left his kingdom to spend his lifetime in meditation and contemplation, sitting on the banks of the river, slowly his mind drifted away from his spiritual disciplines, and he began to spend his lifetime only in taking care of the little animal, the deer. And at the time of death, he forgot to think of God, he forgot to meditate on God. He was being consumed by his worry and concern and anxiety for the safety of the animal. And remember, compassion is a good thing, a great thing. It's part of spirituality. But one should remember, it is not the whole of spirituality. So, in his case, what happened, because he was meditating and thinking only about the safety of the animal, instead of thinking of God, he was reborn as a deer. But the old samskaras were there. He didn't forget those samskaras, those impressions coming from previous life. So he was very much frightened, afraid to go out of the hermitage. So this deer, it never went outside the boundary of the asrama or the hermitage. He remained there all the time, because he didn't want to take another risk. So, and he spent all his lifetime, this animal, thinking of God. And he was born as a great saint. He called it Jada Bharata. So this is how the story goes. So, what happened, in the case of the king who had left his kingdom, in his expression of compassion, he forgot his own spiritual ideal. So even for a great man, this happens. So Shankaracharya says, न प्रमाद नानर्थो अन्यो ज्ञानिनस्सु स्वरूपतः तदो मोहस्तदो अहम धीस्तदो बन्धस्तदो व्यथा. It means when a person forgets his spiritual ideal, it's just like the rubber ball falling on the top step of the ladder, and it starts leaping and bounding, and it doesn't stop. It leaps and bounds, it moves downward, and it doesn't stop till it hits the rock bottom. But Girish Chandra Ghosh was a genius. He was a very clever man, saying the spiritual cleverness. When Sri Ramakrishna asked him, you give full responsibility, he had he didn't have to think for a moment. Immediately he agreed. But he was a sincere person. So every time the impulse, the thought came to his mind to start drinking, Sri Ramakrishna's picture appeared in his mind and he stopped. Whenever any bad thought, bad impulse, bad tendency emerged in his mind, again, well, I have given my responsibility to the holy person. At least I should not put him into trouble. Because if I do something wrong, the responsibility will be his, Because when you give power of attorney, even in law, you have to be, you have some limitation in your own exercise of power. The lawyer, legal representative has a responsibility. Of course, there ends the similarity. But in spiritual life, when you give power of attorney, kind of self-surrender, self-dedication, what happens when you dedicate yourself to God? Actually, a divine will begins to operate through you. And you are not losing freedom, rather, you are entering the world of spiritual freedom. It releases a new, fresh way of energies, intellectual powers. If you can think of the great spiritual teachers of the world, give a thought to this. We still remember Christ, who lived maybe 30 years. We remember Shankaracharya, 32 years. Buddha, 80 years. Sri Ramakrishna, less than 50. And Vivekananda, 39. Now, we think of the impact of the influence, the continuing influence of these great spiritual personalities. The creative, constructive, positive impact on human civilization, it continues whether we like it or not. Even agnostics and atheists cannot deny the creative influence of the great spiritual teachers of the world. And they didn't live for long, especially those who lived very short lifetime, like Shankaracharya, Christ, or Vivekananda. Even Sri Ramakrishna also didn't have a very long life. But their impact that left behind, inspiring people, millions of people, not only in one country or one society or those belonging to one tradition or religious faith system, but wherever there is a noble impulse in your heart, you feel a connection with the great ideals of great teachings of the great spiritual teachers. That is their work. So the most hardworking, productive, creative executives of the world, in terms of sheer accomplishments, were spiritual teachers. Because their contributions continue to be felt and their contributions continue to influence human civilization for thousands of years, for centuries. The effect of the impact of the great men of so-called executives who may work for 15 hours a day, live for maybe 90 years, as soon as they die, they are gone once for all. But these great spiritual teachers, their stature continues to grow and their influence continues to grow. And they continue, their teachings and their words and their life continue to inspire people all over the world. So that's because they worked under a divine will. If we work within the limits of our own will, the impact will be very, very limited. But when we unite our will to a higher will, when we unite our mind to a cosmic mind, which is what is really happening when a person dedicates himself to a spiritual ideal, as Girish and Ghosh did, what happens, his will was linked, connected to a higher divine will, a spiritual willpower. So he continued, and Sri Ramakrishna did not ask him to stop doing anything. He told him, you continue doing what you are doing. And he continued writing. It is said, he continued writing, he continued acting, he continued to be an active participant in the development of the drama till maybe just a few days before his passing away. And he passed away with a smile in his heart, with the name of Sri Ramakrishna on his lips. So that shows there's a great message for all of us to take, even in these modern times. If we can think of some higher ideal, and if we link our own little will to the higher ideal, the higher will, what happens, we are actually connecting a little stream to the mighty ocean or to a source of perennial waters. In the stream or the tunnel or maybe small little well or lake which is half dry is linked through a canal to a mighty river of perennial waters, then that stream never gets dried up. As I mentioned, but it requires a lot of spiritual courage. And Girish and Ghosh had that spiritual courage and the spiritual integrity to that. As I mentioned earlier in the last session, he emptied his cup completely. So whatever Sri Ramakrishna filled his cup with was complete. Just I mentioned this earlier in the last session. When you have a cup in your hand, and if it is half empty and half full of water, and somebody pours milk into your glass, you get only 50% milk. Even the other person fills the cup completely with milk, it's only 50% milk, because the other 50% is water which you had already in the cup. But suppose before somebody pours milk into your cup, if you empty your cup, and if the other person pours milk, you get a glass full of milk, 100%. And Girish Chandra Ghosh had the humility to empty his own cup. So when Sri Ramakrishna poured his milk of spiritual compassion, Girish got 100% pure milk because his mind was full of the spiritual divine bliss. That's what happened to him. So in modern times, we have a great message from Girish Chandra Ghosh. Whatever we may do, different professions, different walks of life, different obligations in this modern complex society, if we can link ourselves to a higher spiritual ideal, we can keep our own life connected to the perennial waters of spirituality. That's a great message from the story of Girish Chandra Ghosh. So thank you. Namaskar. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, we can't have interaction, but very soon, I believe, maybe from next month onwards, we will be able to make some arrangement for interaction and Q question answers in this hall itself. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.